And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Ladies and gentlemen, check us out. Please hit the subscribe button here. Trying to build my website. I really would appreciate it. Thank you so much. And tonight I got an interesting story for you. Well, listen, you got a situation here where conservatives are really trying to find sort of any last gasp, hope in order to save civilization, save America, save everything that's gone wrong within sort of post-Enlightenment civilization now, because really everything is unraveling from the breakdown of the culture to the destruction of the family to the abject corruption of the political system. And so in this kind of classical liberal mindset where we put everything into rationalistic thoughts, we're trying to always find a way that will give us hope that we don't fall into this sort of the depths of socialism, Marxism, communism, New World Order, whatever you want to call it at this point in history. And so the right is always using the scientific method in essence to do an analysis to give themselves some type of last desperate hope here in again post-modernity, in an attempt to try and salvage something as again the culture and civilization in general goes further and further to the left, especially in America, going to the left since 1776, 1789, 1964, or 1864, I should say. Pick your date, it doesn't matter. America perpetually going to the left. One of the things I came across was there's a site called Timcast IRL here on YouTube, and they seem to be decent fellows. They talk a lot of issues. I think they're more like, I believe, I haven't watched too much right of center, kind of libertarian-esque. I could be wrong there, but I think that's kind of where they're at. And they recently brought up a story that I think is kind of interesting, fascinating, but also highlights some of the problems that we face out in the West. And that is Chinese men not allowed to get vaccinations as China faces population crash, right? As you guys know, China for many decades had a one-child policy in an attempt to control their populations. As a result of that, the male sort of births were valued. Female births were sort of discarded via abortion or forced abortion in those countries, and it's created a massive demographic problem where you got a bunch of men walking around in China without the ability to find an adequate number of women in their lives because they've aborted off a good portion of their female populations. Well, now the Chinese are starting to figure out that this demographic problem is going to be a problem, because if men are not being useful, men are not raising families, men become violent. That's what happens. And now China has figured out here that you got a situation that, okay, now it's time that, we need to start populating more. We need more women. And so now they have banned men from getting vasectomies, according to this report from Timcast IRL. And so, which leads to my first question. I'm not sure just, banning vasectomy handles a demographic issue that you've created over decades and decades and decades, but they're trying to do something here, right? At this point in history now, to deal with the problem they created long ago through communism, Marxism, and what have you. And so you got a situation here where, from the standpoint of the West, it creates a problem, because in America, we've gone down this path similarly, not the same, obviously. We haven't had forced vaccinations or forced abortions in America. We've just simply propagandized and brainwashed people through media and through Hollywood and things of that nature, and through sort of these moral justifications of our educational system of these far left principles to just abort their babies willingly. See, the difference is, of course, in China, they're forced abortions. Here, we call it freedom and liberty. But in the end, it's the same effect, right? Because as our population numbers have dwindled, Americans are not replacing themselves anymore. We were at 2.1 births per family, which is basically breaking even on replacement level. Well, recent numbers have showed that America now is down to 1.7 children per house, which is now below replacement level. And this is why immigration becomes such a big issue. Now, for the Chinese over there, who are very nationalistic, they don't like immigration all that much. This becomes a problem in a lot of ways, especially when you need more workers and things of that nature. But in America, we've been willing to accept immigrants here, right? And same with Europe. Well, I don't know about accept, but it's been forced upon us. And that's one of the ways we've dealt with it here in regards to labor shortages and things of that nature. But for the Chinese, now they're trying to figure out they got a problem, they're trying to solve it. And in many respects, here are these policies now to where they're going to get their people to start procreating, while in the West, we're still pushing contraception en masse, abortion on demand, and destroying the family and any really economic incentives for people to partake of family life anywhere. That's the other factor here. And a lot of that comes from the right more than it does the left in a lot of ways by supporting the usury system. But what is interesting is, and listen, I'm not an expert on China, and I'll let somebody else get into that. I think it's an interesting story, considering that once again, it proves that, guess what? The church was right. The Catholic civilization is right, that the immoralities of contraception and vasectomies, which the Catholic Church has taught for a couple thousand years, will come back to bite you. Not only was it morally wrong, but it was demographically wrong. It was socially wrong, and the church has been proven right again. Just like the church will be proven right that Americans contracepting en masse is going to be a disaster, and I would argue it already is. But that's for another show. What I'd like to get into here, though, is this demographic problem in America and how conservatives deal with this problem, particularly still not recognizing the spiritual and the theological and the moral deficiencies that America is going through. As these gentlemen here were talking about the problems of the Chinese, and they related back to America, how Americans are not reproducing, and how this, listen, it doesn't look good here. As American breeds or American population is dying off, the rest of the world, including China, they're procreating. They're simply going to outpopulate us and beat us, sort of from, that mechanism at the end of the day when we're talking about global competition. The future looks bright for China. The future looks poor for America. That's one of the arguments that's been brought up. And so in this context, these authors try to present, at least give some hope to the political right and how we're going to deal with some of these issues in the future, particularly with population issues, and how we're going to defeat liberalism in the end as liberalism continues to encroach. And again, it's a scientific method here. And let me play the clip for you here, and then I got a few takes on it, okay?
Wrong, to say one of the biggest detriments to the woke left is that if they are unsuccessful in their attempts to get their ideology in schools, they will eventually cease to exist. And the math is actually really simple. I've actually covered this. It's very interesting. There is a Pew Research poll showing that Generation Z is slightly more conservative than millennials, but still very progressive in the same way millennials are, just leaning a little bit. And a lot of people assumed this meant that Generation Z was like waking up, they were realizing, but it's not true. What we're actually seeing is the ramification of replacement levels from the early 2000s. So if you go back to the early 2000s, you'd see many studies show liberals were having something like 1.5 kids on average, and conservatives were having 2.01, which meant conservatives are replacing themselves and liberals weren't. Fast forward 20 years, what do you get? You get 20-year-olds voting, and they lean a little bit more right, not because they believe what conservatives believe, but just because there are more conservative Gen Z than there are liberal ones. That will persist. But as many people have pointed out, progressives and leftists don't have kids, they have yours. So if they cannot get their ideology in schools, then we're looking at 20, 40 years, 2 more cycles, and 2 more generations, and the United States becomes overwhelmingly conservative.
So this.
Okay, there you go. All right. There's the scientific method, how conservatives are going to win the battle, right? That because we're more religious and more conservative, we're having more children. Liberals are aborting their children. Hence, that means a more conservative population in the future years to come for America. And guys, let me tell you, this is exactly the way I used to think. I started podcasting 20 years ago. These are the same exact arguments I was making 20 years ago when I was in the classical liberal camp, saying this is the science, this is the math, this is sort of the rationalistic formula, this is how we win. Here we are 20 years later, and the right is not winning, okay? And the future looks even worse than it ever has before. The one thing the gentleman in this clip says is right, and now listen, I think this gentleman means well, I do. I get the thinking, I was there, and in many ways, I like to believe his argument. I would, as I do side with the right more than I do with the left, without a doubt. The left is, you guys know what I think. It's lunacy on that side of the aisle. And so I respect the argument, but here's the problem, and what he does get right, and which is the key, and that is the left may not procreate and have their own children, but they got your children. See, it's a liberal society that is churning at every level, right? Not only government, but Hollywood, the media, academics, sporting events, the corporation, book events, library day, whatever you want. The left is dominating, and they're churning to change hearts and minds. But even more so, the one thing conservatives never want to deal with is they're churning mankind's passions constantly, right? To get them to fall into their sort of fallen nature, to collapse their fallen nature and to embrace sin. And this is how they've always been able to win. And this is why it is more likely in this world that children from conservative homes actually become liberals than it is liberals becoming conservatives, right? It goes again to the basic fundamental nature, again, our fallen nature, right? The liberal society, the liberal establishment that was given to us by classical liberals. See, classical liberals believe that they control man's fallen nature by economics, right? The economic engine of prosperity. As long as we all kind of do the business transactions, we all have a vested interest in the economy, everybody plays by the rules, we got a bunch of property rights in place, you do you, I do me, as long as we're across property lines, we don't shoot each other. But what we found out in a society that has never acknowledged true faith and true religion, like America never has, is that actually there's something more than Americans like more than money. And that is their comforts and their pleasures, particularly their sexual pleasures, their fallen nature. And this is why there's many people that are willing to go to the polls to justify all these fallen passions. And guess what? They're still going to get their money by saying, the government will just redistribute to me, or I get my government job, or I get my union job. It's been worked out in that respect. This is why when you look at something like the Supreme Court, and this is just a small microcosm of the problem, how many liberal justices that were appointed by liberal presidents or liberal administrations actually convert over to the right and become conservatives? I've never seen one in my lifetime. But look at the other way around. How many conservative appointed or Republican appointed Supreme Court justices have gone from right to left? Plenty enough. In fact, it's the funny little joke I have is like drawing straws to see who's going to kick the political right in the balls next on this next decision coming down the pipe, right? I mean, it's the joke that I have now at this point in history. And so, because liberal civilization is designed to take us further and further to the left. That's what it is. Secular civilization is designed to take us away from the supernatural elements of true faith and true religion. That's what the point of the Enlightenment was. That's the point of what classical liberal civilization is. It was designed to take us further in that direction. And this is why we've seen society liberalize as much as it has over the past, well, really 200, 250 years. But I think in our lifetime alone, we could see a vast discrepancy in moral principles that have been turned on their heads just over the past few decades alone, right? It's like I told you so many times before, morality in my lifetime alone, I barely turned 50. It's completely different than what it was 30, 40 years ago from what I remember. Moral principles have been turned upside down. And this is the kind of churning liberal society that inflames our passions, sort of, inflames our fallen nature to get us essentially to fall, which effectively means we're always going to the left because the left will justify our fallen nature. The left will ultimately ratify our sins. And this is something that conservatives have never wanted to deal with because conservatives walked away again from the spiritual battle, from the supernatural elements of society and how they're those principles are intricately involved with our status as human beings, right? We simply deal with things on a naturalistic level through logic and reason, rationalism, right? And this is where the right always is. And it's funny because the right continues to lose. In fact, the right doesn't even fight on the same battlefield anymore like they once used to in regards to faith and religion. They surrendered it completely. And for some strange reason, they've allowed the left to dominate the talking points through this rationalistic principles in order to govern society. And this is where the right always loses. Listen, it doesn't matter how many conservatives, or should I say, how many children conservatives are having at this point in history. If your society, your culture, and your family is destroyed, and it's all drenched in liberalism, Far leftism, it's only natural that culture is going to soak up like a sponge many of its offspring, especially as families break down and as conservative values have to be protected through faith and religion and in the home, steady homes as those families break down, because even more and more conservatives now are accepting what we would call adverse social behaviors, accepting things that at one time were considered immoral, but now the right is kind of relenting a little bit, right? Just take a look at contraception. How many conservatives you know actually believe contraception is wrong or is a sin, or even more so will acknowledge that contraception has been a problem not only to society at large, not only to destruction of the family, but has aided the political left in their power grab over the past century? How many conservatives make that argument? Hardly any. They're all too scared, right? Part of it is, of course, a democratic process. We need a female vote. We got to win the next election because the next election is, in essence, our creed, right? It's how we govern ourselves. It's how we determine right from wrong, good from evil. And it's how we control our lives in many respects, right? How government, whether it has power or doesn't have power over our lives. And as conservatives have watered down their beliefs, as conservatives have gone away from Orthodox Christianity and maybe taken a more watered down flavor of Christianity, what that has come to moral principles, and there's a liberalizing effect throughout all of the nation now. And this has been a process now. Now, there are some libertarian-esque type conservatives in the Midwest and things like that. Not only they're religious, but they hold on to still some economic sort of conservatism values, you know, believing in the free market principles. That plays a factor too. But in essence, when you have a society that has become morally depraved, absolutely morally depraved, and your family has broken down, trust me, the sins of the flesh are going to dominate at the polls. Eventually, at some point, even more than economics. Not that I'm saying economics doesn't matter, but this is what we're seeing more and more. And this is why the left pushes for what? Younger voters and suffrage across the board for anybody that can, you know, basically read a ballot and stumble their way to the ballot box to punch the lever, whatever it is. That's why they want everybody voting, right? Because the more people that vote, the more manipulation. We have people in society that lack certain elements of skills or intellectual capacity, or even have a vested interest in whatever lifestyle choices they made to vote for the far left candidate, right? This is the byproduct of democracy and how elites gain power, and elites have always used democracy to gain power. As we've noted on this show so many times before, the only thing that stopped the elites throughout its history were the monarchs. The monarchs could step in between sort of the elites and the proletariat class and ultimately, you know, stop the injustice of the past. Now it's an all elitist system that control and dominates all of our civilization, starting with corporations. Those same corporations that at one time, those same guys in the political right said they were the greatest thing since sliced bread. Now, all of a sudden, after this past election, the right says, oh no, well, maybe corporations aren't good. Well, here we are a couple hundred years into this thing. The country has gone to the far left, and now you figure that out? When a lot of us were telling you that this altruistic free market thing, apart from moral principles, even within the economy, is a problem as corporations consolidate more and more power and leaving less power to the lower classes, as we've seen. Now we have classes of people that have no power at all. They don't own their land. They don't own their homes, right? They're in a proverbial slave wage class economic system, employer-based system, right? Where they don't own the tools of the trade. Many people have become absolutely feeble in their attempt even just to raise their families. And this is the same reason why you'll never remove the welfare state from America or any Western nation, as much as conservatives want to talk about, we got to get people off welfare. Taxation is theft. And if you take a welfare check, you're stealing from your neighbor. That's garbage. And that's always been a garbage argument by the political right, because it's the political right that has empowered the corporatist system, a usury system that has taken people off the land and taken the tools of the trade away from them in order to give corporations power. Now that you've realized that the corporations are finally problematic because you claim they stole an election last year, well, it's a little bit too late. You've come to realization at a point in history where the whole thing is collapsing now. And now we're trying to find any excuse or any measure to give the conservative movement in America any kind of last hope that there is some kind of hope left to save this system. when in fact the country goes further and further and further to the left and go no further than the breakdown of morality and the breakdown of family, as I've told you here the entire time. If you believe conservatives are going to outpopulate liberals, that may be the case to a certain extent, but that doesn't mean there's going to be victories at the ballot box, but even more so, victories at the cultural level, at the familial level, or even the political level. America has gone to the far left since 1776. That's all you have to remember. And it's done so by consuming the culture through liberal and secular means, killing off the faith, which destroys the family and eventually rots away at the culture. That's all you got to know. There's no easy fix to the problems of modernity. In fact, it's like we said so many times here before, here in the Knights of Christendom, it comes down to faith, true religion, true faith. It's something America has never acknowledged. It's something that conservatives on the right never acknowledge. And until they do, your rationalistic principles are only going to continue to fail, as they failed now for, well, a couple hundred years. There you go, ladies and gentlemen. Quick cast tonight on conservatives and trying to populate the left to victory. You can't make this stuff up anymore. All right, man, this is Frank signing off for Frankie Speaking. Good night, everybody.